Flooding is becoming a bigger threat across the coastal United States, from sea surges to heavy inland rains that overwhelm local infrastructure. Events like the devastating impacts of Hurricane Helene in North Carolina and last year's destructive floods in Leominster and western Massachusetts show how quickly conditions can change and how unprepared some areas might be. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined by Katherine Antos, the Undersecretary of Decarbonization and Resilience, to discuss how Massachusetts is addressing these rising risks and rising tides, and what's being done to both address short-term flood risks and the growing threat of sea level rise and more frequent storms across the state. Undersecretary, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, to quickly introduce you to listeners, you've been in this role for about a year and a half now, coming over from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. So, what's been the most unexpected, either in scale or in actual issue substance, that you've had to deal with since you actually entered this specific government role?
Since I've been in this role, we really have seen the impacts of climate change front and center. In the summer of 2023, we had very drastic flooding in western Massachusetts. In September, we had the flooding in Leominster and Attleboro. Also in September of 2023, we had schools that were closed because of a heat wave, and we couldn't keep our schools cool enough to be safe for students and teachers and the people who work there. We also had extreme weather last winter. And so we've seen a lot of the impacts. And then this summer we had a heat wave in June, and normally that's not when you get heat waves, and that's just so much harder on the body. And so since I've been in this role, even though it's just been a year and a half, you're seeing front and center that climate change, it's happening now, and we need to deal with the impacts now. And fortunately, we do have a plan and a strategy that we are implementing to make ourselves more resilient to those changes.
Right. To dig in on that Leominster bit as well, of course, millions in damage. Western Mass is an area that's not only residential but also agricultural. There are huge impacts all over the region when this happens. And one of the reasons that we're talking about flooding today is because of Hurricane Helene down in western North Carolina, which, like in Western Mass, included a lot of inland flooding. So when you saw what was going on in North Carolina, does something go through your head? Do you think, oh gosh, we have to stop that from happening here in Massachusetts? Or is there something that feels very fundamentally different about these sorts of inland regions?
Well, first, my heart goes out to the southeastern U.S. right now, to what Florida and also the Carolinas experienced. My heart goes out to the hundreds of people who lost their lives, to their families, and also to these communities that have just been devastated by this storm. You know, we are deploying resources to go down and help. We have their back. I send them strength and resilience as they recover. They are going to recover, but we're in this together, and we're facing it now. And I will say there are parallels between what we saw with Helene and Massachusetts in terms of what started with concern about coastal flooding and the storm surge, and then really it was the inland flooding that had such drastic impacts. And similar in Massachusetts, what our Massachusetts climate change assessment showed is that we are going to have by 2050 like 2.5 feet of sea level rise. We are going to have more extreme heat. But when you look at where is there the greatest impacts in terms of impacts on our built infrastructure, it is actually the inland flooding along our rivers, but then also from extreme rainfall events. So it is a similar story to what we saw in the Carolinas. While that might seem like despair, climate change is happening, we know it's going to get worse, I'm actually filled with hope because I know that the worst impacts, they are not inevitable. There are things that we can do. If we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions globally, drastically, we can ward off the worst impacts of climate change. And so when we look at what are the sea level projections or what are the precipitation projections by the end of this century, they will be less if we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. That's what Massachusetts is doing. We're going to cut our emissions in half by 2030 and be net zero by 2050. We can set an example for how this can be done, and also that there's steps that we can take now to make our communities, our residents, our businesses more resilient to those climate change impacts as we begin to experience them now.
Great. You brought up a bunch of different things we're going to dig into in a bit more detail. Let's sort of start with that prediction there when we're thinking about how much we understand that the sea level is going to rise, where we understand where these risks of what we talk about as 100-year storms are going to happen, when we talk about the difference between coastal flooding risks versus river adjacent flooding risks. What are you looking at in the EEA to try and figure out where these areas are most at risk over what timeline? Because then, of course, that impacts what sort of mitigation measures are needed in any of these particular regions.
Yeah, that's such a great question, because a common theme across what we are doing statewide is figuring out how to prioritize actions. What do we need to do first to protect our people, to protect our natural resources, to protect our infrastructure? So when we think about coastal impacts, there we are really thinking about sea level rise that's caused by a combination of warming waters. When things get warmer, they take up more space. Also, glacial melt, and then also the storm surge. When you have a storm event, it's going to push more water and cause more erosion. And so we have what's called a Massachusetts coastal flood risk model, which takes into account both sea level rise and also inundation from storm events, and allows us to see both now and over time what is the probability that an area is going to flood. So is it like a 1% risk, like it might happen once every 100 years, or is it like a 10% risk, it might happen once every 10 years? And it can also tell us, and what are those flood elevations? So how far up will the water come? And that's critically important for us as we think about what is the transportation infrastructure, for example, the roadways that we need to elevate. So we still have evacuation routes. Where are areas that we either do not want to build or we want to build differently so that we are not putting people in harm's way? When we think about our inland flood risk, I will be honest, that is an area when I came in that we had less information. It was a data gap. And it's not just Massachusetts. You see this, I've seen this in other places where I've worked as well. And so a step that we are taking is in partnership with USGS and with researchers at Tufts. We are working on developing a mapping and modeling tool that is going to allow us to understand both what you brought up, the riverine flooding, but then also what's called pluvial flooding, which is like the flooding from rainfall of just on overland, because our storm drains aren't big enough to handle a storm of that size. And so based on that, where is the flooding going to occur? What is the likelihood? Again, projecting it over time. And that's going to be the kind of thing that we can use as we're designing a culvert or building a building to make sure that we are siting it in a way and sizing it in a way so that it can be able to handle conditions today and conditions throughout the useful life of that asset. So again, that really helps us to prioritize, and also by looking at those maps, that can also tell us, and here's where we need to start first. Like, here's the area that's going to be at greatest risk in 2030 versus 2040, or here's that flood pathway where that sea level rise is going to start coming into communities. We need to address that spot first.
Right. And thinking about the different strategies that are available, I wrote last week or the week before, time is a blur, about Boston doing kind of this deployables day, this show and tell essentially across the city of temporary barriers essentially to deal with flooding, surges, that kind of thing, not looking at specifically like pushing back a king tide, for instance, but if there's a swell, but these are temporary. And of course, that's happening at the same time as the city and the state are thinking about long-term coastal resilience, coastal infrastructure. So if you could kind of dive a little bit into how you think about how long a short-term solution is supposed to be lasting, how kind of permanent a short-term solution should feel, this idea of should you be putting out these deployable barriers forever, or is the idea that at some point, hopefully, you won't need those as a backup? So kind of how you stack those priorities when it comes to the actual infrastructure.
No, that's a great question. And also just the fact that we're throwing around terms like deployables and we're nodding and knowing what each other are talking about, those temporary structures that can pop into place so that if there is flooding, there's there's a wall or something like that that protects, say a transit opening or a door or, buildings.
They're kind of neat looking. They look sort of intense. If you go around the aquariums stop and suddenly a bunch of these little metal plates are popping up surrounding those entrances around the subway stations, or these big walls that just kind of come in looking like a deck of cards, and then you put them up and you fold them up and they're a watertight seal on some of these areas. It's interesting tech.
It is very interesting. And Joe Christo at the Stone Living Lab, who has been really essential in some of this work in Boston, actually a year ago, he and I and some colleagues from our Coastal Zone Management Program, we were in the Netherlands to look at how they look at deployables and flood barriers and different also nature-based solutions, as well as inland flooding solutions. And so it was really interesting to see not just what we have here in Boston, but also what they're doing in other parts of the world.
Thinking about the actual coastal resiliency planning itself, it's a combination of this gray and green infrastructure. So, of course, these permeable and semi-permeable and natural solutions, and it seems like there's a whole host of options when it comes to trying to shore up the shoreline. So how are you thinking about where some of those are best suited and others are not? The difference between a seawall and kind of one of those sandy beaches, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we know that this is a question a lot of our communities are asking. It's really easy to feel overwhelmed by everything, everywhere, all at once. And so we need to chunk it down so this makes sense and we know where to start. So we actually have a resilient coast strategy that we launched a year ago and is going to wrap up shortly into the new year. But basically it's saying right now we have 78 coastal communities. Based on our sea level rise projections, we actually say it's going to be 98 communities that are going to be impacted by coastal flooding. And so they are all a part of this strategy. And a reason that they're all a part of it is because we can't leave it to those almost 100 communities to be figuring this out on their own. It's not efficient. And honestly, a lot of the challenges and the types of vulnerabilities and the types of assets that we're looking to protect, there's a lot of similarities along that coast. And so it makes sense to be working on it together. Through that project, we have identified coastal resilience districts that allows us to understand, all right, based on this area, here's the type of thing that would be a best practice. Here's something that you can do, and then we can start to implement that strategy. Getting to your question more specifically, how might you make a decision between the two? It's very site specific, but some of what comes into it is just how much space do you have to work with? So in an urban area, you might want something like a beautiful living shoreline that takes a lot of space. But honestly, because you have shipping channels, because you have property that's coming right up to the sea edge, that just because of space, some nature-based solutions might not be possible, whereas others are. Something like a living seawall, which takes up a lot less space, but it still includes some vegetation, so it still has that habitat co-benefit, and it is still more effective than just a hard seawall when it comes to reducing that wave action and also creating a structure that can provide protection. So a lot of it just comes down to what do you have space to do? You would also want to take into account the particular ecosystem and habitat that you're looking to protect. Cost is a consideration as well. And then other factors too, like what is the wave action? There might be something that would work in a quiet area, but it would just be completely blown out to sea in an area with greater wave action. So those are all factors that we are working together through this Resilient Coast strategy and our almost 100 communities to figure out what makes sense where should you start taking action first to help them come up with that action strategy.
So the cost of this is so fraught because there's both a cost of doing something and then the cost of not doing something. Mm-hmm. A lot of communities have really seen the impact when it comes to what it does to your insurance costs when you live in something that might not have been a flood zone before but is now, what it takes to green or make more resilient your property if you're a coastal property. What do you do if maybe the best option would be to think about retreating from an area that looks likely to become very, very flooded? So let's start with sort of the individual person, the person living in these areas and their costs. What are they looking at now, or what is the state monitoring in terms of the brunt for these homeowners, farmers who are trying to figure out what they are expected to sort of stomach as we see these sorts of flooding events become more and more common?
Yeah, well, first I'll say one of the most important things that an individual can do is get flood insurance. And that's going to mean if an event strikes, if there is flooding, it's going to be so much easier to get resources to help you recover. And it's not just if you're a building owner, it could also be if you're a renter too. Just protect your property. It's going to help you out. So that is one key piece. I will say in Massachusetts, we're lucky compared to some other parts of the country where you can't get insurance anymore or the prices have just gone up really high. I mean, we certainly do have areas where insurance costs are going up, but overall we are still insurable. So that is definitely something that individuals should be doing. But speaking of the insurance industry, there is so much we can learn from them in terms of how they assess risk. And so actually later this month, working with the Green Ribbon Commission, we have a convening of insurance experts from around the country. This has been done in other areas too, to help us think through what is the role of insurance and resilience. And so one thing that we're interested in, for example, is if a property takes certain resilience measures so that it is less at risk to flood damage during a storm, should your insurance rates be lower? Or let's take that out a level and say, let's look at it at the neighborhood scale. If there's something like a resilience district where property owners are working together, because when you gave the example of deployables, if side-by-side neighbors, if one did it and the other didn't.
The water's just going to that other guy.
Right? Yeah,
Right.
Exactly. The water will just go. And so how do you look at this at a neighborhood scale? And if you're doing something like a resilience district, then how might that be reflected in insurance? So looking at it in terms of how do we try to come up with solutions that protect affordability while also protecting our property, and also what are ways that insurance can also be an incentive for the types of things that we can be doing to protect our residents, to protect our property.
And then pivoting over onto the state's side of this cost metric, I guess the question is, what does it cost, and are we putting enough into these climate resilience measures? But then it's always going to be in conversation with what is the cost of not doing it? What is the risk and the economic impact of these sorts of flood events becoming more and more common? So can you contextualize what the do nothing answer is, and then what is the ticket price on doing enough?
Yeah, well, I'll say you have asked two of the questions that I asked first and foremost when I came in. Of one, where are the data gaps? This is grounded in science, but where do we need to better understand? And then two, how are we going to pay for it? So a couple pieces there. One, the Healey-Driscoll administration this is a top priority for them. So a year ago, Governor Healey adopted our statewide hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan, ResilientMass, that keeps us eligible for FEMA funding. And then also, in the capital budget that she then next released, there was a 7-fold increase in the capital dollars specifically to implement those almost 150 actions in ResilientMass. And those are all actions that are going to happen within 5 years. We know state funding alone is not enough. So also, this administration has been laser focused on going after federal dollars. We have our Federal Funding and Infrastructure Office, and through that, they've been able to bring in resources for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for improving our transportation infrastructure, but they've also been able to get a lot of resources for resilience as well. But again, we know that we can't expect grants alone to take care of this. And so we are also looking at what are different ways that we can cover the costs of resilience measures. And actually just last week, we had our first resilience finance and investment strategy stakeholder advisory group. So this is an initiative. It is an action of the ResilientMass Plan. It was also a recommendation of the climate chief to say we've got to look at innovative ways to understand the investment needs for resilience and then to come up with a strategy to pay for it. And so we have an expert team that has done this work in cities and states around the country, and they're working with us. And then we have a really strong, I think almost 50 people on a stakeholder advisory committee across different sectors to help us think through what will work in Massachusetts. And I really want to underscore the term finance. This isn't just about what are more federal grants that we can apply for. It's more like, no, how can we use innovative finance mechanisms to help our dollars go further by leveraging markets to do that? And so, like I said, that work has just kicked off, and we're really going to be leaning into it this fall and winter to help us figure out, what is that long-term financing strategy for how we can address those costs.
Are there any numbers that we could use to kind of help anchor this in people's minds, like how much we are spending on this versus, how far is that falling short, or is that something that's very dependent on figuring out where those gaps are?
So part of the work that is underway is understanding what are the investment needs for the state across different key resilience measures. So I do not want to get ahead of that, but I will say when we look at examples of some of our grant programs, for example, we are seeing large increases in terms of what the demand is, how many applications are coming in versus how much we're able to fund. And so our most recent round of coastal zone management grants, it was, I think, 5 times the amount that we were able to award compared to the applications. For the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or MVP, that's our flagship local level resilience program that starts with those cities and towns doing a plan to identify those vulnerabilities, and then through action grants implementing that plan. This past year, we funded about twice as much as we had in previous years, and it was the most we've ever awarded for this grant program. The average award of those grants was also almost twice as much as our communities are transitioning from planning to actually doing the construction of resilience measures. So we've taken many steps to help make that easier, like make those dollars available over multiple years, provide additional resources specifically for inland flooding based on what so many of our communities experienced last year. Another number that I think is really important to keep in mind, especially when you think about finance, is the cost-benefit ratio of this. And so if you are spending $1 on a resilience measure, that's likely going to save you $5 to $10 in avoided damages down the line. And so while some of these price tags might seem a lot, it is so small in comparison to the damages that would be experienced if we do not do anything.
This, of course, is part of a regional conversation. It's not just regional in Massachusetts, it's also regional across the country, across the world right now. One of the things that these resilience plans across Massachusetts have dealt with and acknowledged the probability of is climate migration, either inside the state or from outside coming into the state. So what impacts are you watching from a resilient infrastructure perspective that could have an impact on where people are moving? An easy example, I guess, for me that comes to mind, and you don't have to use it, is thinking about what happens if there are some areas where the best thing to do is to either do a managed retreat or use these sort of coastal areas to basically push back, invest in more sort of green infrastructure or soft infrastructure to prevent that flooding. But it means that people who might be in those plains would now have to go somewhere else, for instance. Mm-hmm. You don't want people to just be living in a place that is about to flood if there's not a plan for a way to stop it. So how are you thinking about the way that flooding and other climate-related events are moving people around the state and what the regional planning is needed for that?
Yeah, well, a few different things. First, in terms of climate migration, that is one of the impacts that we consider in the ResilientMass Plan and the climate change assessment. As we rank those based on how big is that impact, so to use sea level rise as a comparison, how much is the water going to come up compared to the disproportionality of that impact, so how much more would it impact, say, an environmental justice community or a priority population that's either older, younger, has worse health outcomes, so therefore is that much more vulnerable to that climate impact. And then finally, the third factor is the adaptation gap, or how much more do we have to do to be prepared for that impact. So when we combine those three things of what's the magnitude, what's the disproportionality, and then what's the gap that we have to fill, and we use that to rank all of the climate impacts in Massachusetts. Climate migration is not one of our biggest impacts, but it is something that we are considering. The other piece that you were talking about is, so are there some parts of the state that are safer than others? I just want to again highlight, when we look at what happened with Hurricane Helene, that there are areas that people thought that is the safe place, and it's been destroyed now. And so I think something else we are understanding is climate change affects everywhere. It affects different places in different ways, but we need to be thinking about resilience everywhere, and we can't just assume this area is fine. Finally, I will say there are some communities, and a lot of our work starts with that bottom up. What are the needs of a community and what makes sense there? And then we're trying to support regional approaches so that communities can work together, because climate impacts, they don't know political boundaries. It would make it easier if they did, but they don't. And so we do have some communities that are thinking about things like managed retreat and what they might do. Examples being Hull or Barnstable. We also have some other communities like Chatham, which are looking at resilient zoning and just saying, hey, you know what, there's certain areas where it doesn't make sense to build. I will say none of these conversations are easy. These are hard conversations to have. They're hard decisions to have, but we are ready to have those hard conversations. I think the Healy-Driscoll administration has shown that on many fronts, but certainly when it comes to climate change, how are we going to pay for it? What is the solution? What else do we need to be thinking about? And so what we're doing now is looking at examples of programs in other parts of the country and saying, you know, what have they done? What makes sense to do here? And how can we help our communities and also our residents prepare for that?
The last thing that I want to hit is along those lines, actually, which is that I think a lot of people looked at what happened out in Western Massachusetts, looked at what happened in the Carolinas and the Southeast U.S., and did have that thought of, oh no, is anywhere safe? And so how much of this is about redefining what safe means, if that is the word to be using at all? And then how do you have those conversations with communities who are sitting there going, I never thought about flooding in my entire life. Like, flooding from what? How would that be happening? So how are those conversations about what's reasonable to expect and what can be planned for actually kind of happening in practice?
Yeah, well, I think that goes to a bit of what I was talking about earlier, like what are the data gaps that we need to fill? And so part of where we didn't have as good a handle as we could on where is the inland flooding going to happen, either along rivers or in other areas. And again, it comes down to hydrology and physics. Like, we can take the data, we can take the projections, and we can figure this out. And so that's why we are developing the modeling and mapping tools that say, okay, and in this area, you know, now versus 2030 versus 2050, here's your risk if you are here now. And then let's think about where are the areas that we want development to happen? Where are the areas that we do not want development to happen? Or if development is going to happen there, how do we do it in a way that is safer? So, for example, elevating buildings so that the floodwaters that are hitting one building aren't pushing into another area, but rather if you elevate, then that water can pass through. Or a lot of flood damage, oftentimes it's like just a few inches of water and it's really damaging to the mechanicals in a building. So let's elevate that. So part of what we're doing is looking at how do we build the expertise on our boards that think about how do you build so that they have that resilience expertise and can be helping to guide those decisions. We are also working with regional planning agencies and communities to develop a resilience playbook, which is here's what you can do at the local level when you think about zoning and other ordinances to help make your community safer based on here's where the risk and here are some things that you can do about it.
Thanks again to Katherine Antos for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is Claire Wigglesworth. And if you want to help other folks find us, you can leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now. If you want to get in touch directly, email us at codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org. We'll be back in your ears next week.